Let's take a look at what we've got in our kit. We've got some thread, we've got some pre-cut fabric pieces, we've got a booklet with instructions and information, an envelope to return our block when we're finished, and a little piece of fabric with some pins and a needle attached. It's everything that we need to make the classic 9-patch block. It looks just like this. Inside our booklet, we have a little bit of information about what is quilting, about patchwork, that's the technique that we're going to use to make the 9-patch block, and a little bit about the history of the 9-patch block. And the reason that we're starting with this block for the first month of the little free Fibrary program is because it is traditionally one of the easiest and sort of most straightforward blocks to begin learning with. I always recommend that you read over the entire set of instructions before you begin. It's something that I like to do with all the quilt patterns and other sewing patterns I encounter, just to sort of get my mindset in the right place. So it looks like the first thing I'm going to do is mark some lines on my fabric, lay out my pieces, and then begin sewing them together. And we'll walk through each of these steps and all of the rest in the booklet one by one. First step, which is to draw some sewing lines on the back side, or what's typically called the wrong side of our fabric. Now, how do we know which side is the right side and which side is the wrong side? I'm looking at this fabric. It's light blue with a little white floral print, and I can see the design here. If I turn it over, I can see that this is not the side that the design is printed on. This would be the back side, or the wrong side of the fabric. This side would be the front side, the right side of the fabric, or sometimes I've heard folks say the pretty side. This is important because when we sew pieces of fabric together, we want to put them right sides together. We want to make sure that the pretty side is going to face another pretty side when we sew them together. Now, we also have some plain fabric. How do we know which side is the right side and which side is the wrong side? On a fabric like this, without a print on it, if you can't tell which side is the right side and the wrong side, then both are equally good. You can use either side of the solid colored fabric. The first step in our book is to draw some sewing lines. Patchwork is typically done with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. That's quite small. And so I find it very useful to have a guideline, especially when I'm getting started. I have a quilting ruler, but you can use any kind of ruler to do this work. I'm going to take one of my squares. With this ruler, I have various lines that mark distances, right? I can see 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch, so on and so forth. I have a 1/4 inch line right here. It's this dotted line. And I can use that, I can just line that up right along the very edge of my fabric on the wrong side. But remember, we have solid fabric, so it doesn't matter which side we're drawing on. And I'm just going to draw a line. I'm just using a regular pencil. It's totally fine. I wouldn't use a pen or a marker because it might bleed through to the front or the right side of your fabric. And now you can see I have a line drawn along there. We want to do that with all around the sides of our fabric. So for instance here, I'm just going to go around and make sure that I have drawn lines on all 4 sides of this square. These are going to be the lines that I sew on when I sew my squares together. But wait, you say, I don't have a fancy ruler like you do. You can use any ruler or any measuring tool as long as it measures 1/4 of an inch. So for instance here, I have a flexible tape measure. Now I can't measure 1/4 of an inch from the beginning of it because this metal piece is covering up the 1/4 inch. But here, if I start at this big line, and then this is, I know this is 1/2 an inch, halfway between the 1 and the 2, and then between that is 1/4 inch, so it's this line right here. So I can use this, can line up the edge of my fabric with my starting point and measure in 1/4 inch, and I'll make a little dot. Just make a tiny little nub. And then I'm going to do the same toward the other end. Just line up a baseline with the edge of my fabric, measure in 1/4 inch, make a little dot, or a tiny little line, right? It's not very big. And then I can really use anything as long as it has a straight edge to draw a line. I wouldn't use a piece of paper, it's a little too flimsy, but I have an old index card here, and I'm just gonna line it up with those dots. And I like to put my pencil down so I can kind of line up my card against it and make sure everything's okay. And then I'll just use that to draw my line. So you can really use any kind of measuring tool that you have around as long as it has 1/4 inch measurement on it. Step number 2, I always like to lay out all of my fabric pieces before I get started, just so I know which ones I should sew together in what order. For the classic 9 patch, we basically have 3 rows of 3 squares each, and they alternate. So you'll notice that you had 5 colorful squares and 4 plain squares in your kit. And we're going to lay them out in 3 rows of 3. So this first row, I have colorful, plain, colorful. Then I need to alternate my next row. Plain, colorful, plain, and then my bottom row, colorful, plain, colorful. And that is the layout for what my block will look like when it's finished. To sew 2 squares together. Here I have 1 colorful square and 1 plain square, and you'll see that I have my lines, my sewing lines drawn on them already. I'm going to line them up with the right sides together, like this, so that when I look at my squares, I can see my sewing lines. Now I want to line them up very carefully. I want to match them up at the corners so that they lay exactly on top of one another. These fabrics do a pretty good job of sticking themselves together, but fabrics like to move around while we work with them, so this is where I'm going to use the pins. And I'm just going to pin a couple places along the sewing line, and I like to pin perpendicular, and I like to pin through my sewing line. So I put the point of the pin right on the line, down through the fabric, and then back out through the front, just like so. If you like to pin a different way, it's okay. You know, maybe you like to pin sideways like this. That's totally fine. This is just my habit and what I'm useful. Basically, you just want something that's going to hold your fabric together so it doesn't flop around and come apart. And again, you've got your pretty sides, your right sides on the inside, and you've got your wrong sides with your sewing lines on the outside. It does not matter which side you pin on. It doesn't matter if you pin on your plain side or if you pin on your colorful side. I would suggest pinning it all the same. It's just going to make it easier to take out the pins as you work. But whichever side you prefer is totally fine. Now we're ready to get sewing. In order to begin sewing by hand, we need thread and a needle. The first thing we want to do is pull off a length of thread from our spool. I like to pull it maybe about 24 inches long. I basically pull it as far out as I can hold my arm. So I pull it to my chest and hold my arm all the way out, and that's about how long I'm going to cut my thread. And I'm going to cut that piece off. And then I need to thread my needle. And you know, this is a part that can be challenging for folks. Some needles come in different sizes. If you are frustrated that you can't thread your needle, you can always try to find a needle with a bigger eye. And basically I'm just going to take the end of my thread, put it through the eye of my needle. See, even I have trouble doing it sometimes. It'll start to go through a little bit, and you just grab it from the other side and pull it through like so. Make sure that you're not tangling your thread as you're working. Now that we have our needle, it's kind of dangling on our thread here. I'm going to take the two ends of my thread and I'm going to tie them together into a knot. I just tie an overhand knot like this. You can tie any sort of knot that you like. If you have a different needle threading technique that you prefer, or a different knotting technique, that is also fine. But you can see that my needle is now on my thread, and the great thing about it is it's not going to accidentally pull itself out. It's going to stay in because it's tied in on that double length of thread. The double length of thread also ensures that our stitching line will be a little bit stronger since you have two lengths of thread going through and not just one. You can leave this tail on just fine. You don't have to do anything with it. If you do want to trim it, make sure not to trim it right next to the knot, because that means your knot will unravel. Trim it about 1/4 inch away. All right, let's begin sewing. We've got our fabric, it's pinned together. I'm going to work on this side so that it's easier to see. I'm going to do what's called a running stitch. It's the most basic of stitches that I can think of. And basically all we're going to do is put our needle in through one side of the fabric and pull it out the other, and then back again. So I like to start not at this corner because I don't want my knot to sit in that corner. I like to start about halfway between the corner and the end of the fabric. And I'm just going to push my needle right through. Make sure you don't poke your finger. Push your needle through. Pull that thread all the way through until it gets to the knot. And then I'm going to come back up right on that line. Oh, look, I'm not on that line. Don't come up there. Come back up on the line. But I can't see the line from the back. How do I know what to do? I'm going to put my needle through on this line. Oh, look, I can turn it over and I can see the line on this side, and I can use the line on this side to push my needle through. Got a little snagged on my pin there, that's fine. Just pull your pin out, free that up, and pull it. You don't have to pull it super hard. You don't want your thread to break. Just pull it so it's sort of lightly taut. Turn it back to the front, push your needle in, pull it out the back. Push your needle in on the line, pull it out the back. You don't have to turn it. A technique that some people also like to do is to put your needle in and then push it up through the back on the line like this and pull it through. That is also okay. You want to make your stitches about 1/8 inch apart. And that's about how long they should be. If they're bigger, it's not going to hold your fabrics together really well. Smaller is always okay. Bigger is where it starts to be a problem. So I'm just sewing right along this line. And see why I like drawing the lines on here? It makes sure that my stitching is nice and straight. As I'm going along, if I reach these pins, I can just take them out as I work. I don't need to keep them in there once I've sewn past them or up to them. You can also leave them in until you're done. I find they get in my way a little bit. My thread might get snagged on them. So I do like to take them out. And this is called a running stitch. And you'll know that you're doing a correct running stitch when your thread looks like a dotted line all the way across. You take out that pin. All right, I've gotten to the end of my row. I've made this nice line of stitching all the way across. But uh-oh, my thread, my needle, it's stuck on there. What do I do? There are many ways that you can make a knot at the end of your fabric. There's lots of different techniques, and you can search online for a number of different tutorials. One easy trick that I like is I like to cut my thread off near the needle, right? Don't cut your thread right here, or else your whole line of stitches is just gonna unravel. I like to cut it off close to my needle. I'm gonna set my needle aside. I'm gonna put it back, stick it back in my fabric so I don't lose it. Now I have the two ends of my thread. They're probably a little bit twisty around each other, so I'm gonna untwist them, and I can do that just by picking them up and dangling my block, waiting for them to untwist. Okay, I have my two threads untwisted and separated from each other. And all I'm going to do is tie a square knot in them. So I have two threads. I'm going to put the right one over the left one and bring it under and pull the ends. And then I'm going to bring the left one over the right one, pull that one under, and pull the ends. And now I have a knot so that my thread won't come unraveled. And I'm going to trim off my excess thread. And remember, I want to leave a little bit of a tail. I don't want to trim it right next to the knot. I want to trim it 1/4 or 3/8 of an inch away, just like that. Now, one important thing that we want to think about in patchwork when we're doing this kind of work is what we do when we, ta-da, open our block. This is the front side. Notice how sewing the seam with the right sides together, those pretty sides together, makes it so that we don't see the seam when we open it up, right? We just have this really nice edge, but it's a little bit bulky because that seam is there. So what we want to do is what we call pressing our seams. You can press your seams a lot of ways. Some people like to press them to one side, and they have preferences about which side. But just for ease, especially as a beginner, we're going to press them open. And I'm just going to use my fingers. I'm going to separate that seam just like this. And I'm kind of going to use my fingernail to run down the seam and try to make it as flat as possible. This is called pressing your seams open. If you have that ruler from earlier or the edge of a book or something, you can use that as a little bit extra to make that seam flat. If you have an iron, you can absolutely use that, but it is not necessary. It's very easy to do this. We call it finger pressing. And so now we have pressed our seam open. It kind of looks like a little book that you're gonna read. And that is, we've put our very first two squares together. Ta-da! Isn't that amazing? Now we have to add the third square in the row, right? Remember that we had 3 squares going across. And in our top row, we had a colorful square. So this one actually goes like this. And we had a plain square. And now we need to add the next colorful square. We're going to do it in exactly the same way. Make sure that you are attaching it to the correct side. We want to attach this square to this square, so these are the edges we want to line up. We don't want an L shape, right? We want to make a row. So we're going to put the pretty sides together and line up the corners just like we did in the past. We're going to take our pins, and in the same way, we're going to pin these together. Want to make sure that they're lined up straight along the edge together. Put my pins in to hold it together, right, just like we did before. This time we're going to add a new square. I've cut off a length of thread, and I'm going to thread my needle, but I wanted to show you a trick that I like to do to avoid sort of having to tie a knot at the end of the needle. So again, you can thread your needle any way you prefer, whatever's easiest for you. I like to take my length of thread and bring the two ends together and make sure that they're even, just like this. I'm going to take both of those ends and put them through the eye of my needle. This won't work if the eye of your needle is super small, but I tend to work with like a medium-sized needle. Sometimes I can only get one thread on the first go. I have to hold them very tightly together. But I put both of those ends through the needle, and I'm going to pull them about 4 or 5 inches, and I'm just going to let them hang there. I'm not going to tie a knot at all. Oh my gosh! You do want to pay attention that you don't pull your needle really hard and pull it off the end of the thread. But notice now I have a loop at the end. So here's the magic trick. And this is how I like to start off. I'm going to start sewing this row exactly the same way I sewed before. I'm going to put my needle into the fabric on the line and pull it out the back. Now if I pull it all the way, it doesn't have a knot in the end. Oh, it's going to go all the way through. That's not very helpful. I'm going to put it through. I'm going to pull it until I have maybe about 1 inch left. I can see that loop there. I'm going to come up like I'm making my next stitch, but I'm going to come up through that loop. And now when I pull, again, I'm going to pull it taut but not tight. Now it's holding itself by that very loop, so I don't have to make a knot to start with at all. And then I'm just going to continue sewing just like before, right along the line. Taking out my pins as I go. Try to make your stitches nice and even, and don't pull too tight. If you pull too tight, it's going to gather itself up like that. You want it to lay flat. So make sure you're pulling taut, but not tight. Now with this movement that I use where I put the needle through the back and the front at the same time, sometimes I've seen people load sort of multiple stitches on their needle like this. I don't like to do that because I find that my stitches start to get larger the more I do that, and I do want to try to keep my stitches small and even. I also find if I load up my stitches on the needle and I start to pull tight, it starts to gather more, which I don't want. I want it to lie flat. If it's something that you learn to do and you're comfortable with, and as long as everything's lying flat and nice, go for it, right? You know, there's no rules in quilting. There's guidelines and there's different techniques, and sometimes we might choose one technique over another for different reasons, but there's no quilt authority that's going to come and chastise you for doing something the wrong way. And if you ever meet someone like that, you tell them. they're not the boss of you. So I'm going to sew along all the way to the end of my line, about a 1/4 inch from the edge, just like I did before. Now another trick or tip that I like to do is sometimes I like to just go backwards 1 stitch. And that just helps sort of lock everything in. It's not a knot. If I cut it off, it will unravel, but it does help to secure it a little bit and just give it a little extra oomph. Now, because of the way I threaded my needle before, my needle's not stuck on my thread. I can just pull that thread right out of there. I don't have to cut it off, I can just pull it out. And then I can, just like before, I can untwist that thread. Sometimes instead of letting it dangle, I like to take the not sharp side, the eye side of my needle, and put it between my threads and separate them that way, especially if it's quite a long thread. It can take forever to untangle them. Then I'm just going to tie that knot in the same way. Got my right hand thread, my left hand thread, put the right side over the left side, under, pull, put the left side over the right side, pull it under, pull it closed. Trim it a little bit away from the edge. And ta-da! We have now attached the 3rd square in our row. We're going to open it up, finger press it just like we did before. Use my thumbnail to kind of flatten it. But again, you can use a book, or the edge of your ruler works really well if you have a wooden or a plastic ruler. And there we go. 1 whole row complete. All right, we finished our top row. Now we need to work on our 2nd row. This is the row that alternates. Our top row went colorful, plain, colorful. Now our next row is going to go plain, colorful, plain. And we're just going to work that exactly the same way we did before. I'm going to take the 2 right sides or pretty sides and I'm going to line them up together. I'm going to take my pins and put them in along the side that I'm going to stitch. Got my needle and thread, and I'm going to stitch this in exactly the same way. And there I have my 2nd row, the row that goes in the middle of my block. I've sewn all of my squares into their rows. Now I'm ready to sew my rows together to make my complete block. So I've laid them all out in the order that they need to go. And the first thing I'm going to do is pin the top row, row 1, to row 2. Remember, we always want to sew with the right sides or the pretty sides together, so I'm going to take this row and fold it directly on top of that middle or second row. And this is the line that I'm going to pin and stitch across. So I'm going to move this one out of the way so I don't get confused, and I'm going to work on putting my pins in. Now I definitely want to line up the top of my fabrics, but what I find easiest to do is I want to match these corners. So you can see where my pencil lines are going across. I'm going to take my pin and put it right through that seam, right where those 2 pencil lines are going across. It's going to come out the front right where those 2 meet. I'm going to take my second row, that middle row, and I'm going to put the pin through about 1/4 inch down, because I want it to come out at that spot where the pencil line is on the back, about 1/4 inch down, right at that line where the 2 seams meet. And I'm going to put my pin through. And I'm just going to hold it there for now. I'm not going to pin it down to anything. I'm just going to kind of let it hang out while I do that again on the other side here. So again, I'm going to put this pin in right where those 2 fabrics meet, about 1/4 inch down where my pencil line is, and then I'm going to put it through. Let me make sure that my seam is open on the back. Works a lot better if my seam is open. There we go. I've got my seam open. About 1/4 inch down, push my pin through. Now my 2 pins are hanging out. I like to pull them all the way through, and that's going to really make sure that this middle block, for starters, right here, is lined up. So now I'm going to take that pin and I'm going to pin it down all the way through all of my fabrics, just like I did before. And I'm going to do the same thing with this pin on this side. I'm going to take another pin. I like to take one and just put it in the middle right here to hold it. And then I'm going to match my corners. So I'm going to take a pin, I'm going to put it right where my 2 pencil lines meet in the corner. It's sticking through. And then I'm going to take it and I want it to come out where my 2 pencil lines meet on the back side of this block, just like that. I'm going to pull it through. I'm going to kind of jiggle them together a little bit. And then I'm going to pin this down. I'm going to do the same thing with the other corner. Put it in where those pencil lines meet. Poke it through my second fabric, making sure it comes out where those pencil lines meet. Pull it all the way through, straighten it out. Make sure the top is all lined up, and then pin it down. Now I am ready to go. I'm going to sew right along this top line. Exact same way I've sewn all of my previous blocks. When I start to get to my seams, I want to make sure they're open, and I'm just going to sew like they're not there. I'm going to sew like they're part of the fabric, but I do want to make sure that they're open and so that I catch them as part of my work. So you can see I've sewn them flat and I've sewn through all the layers of the fabric. This part right here we would call the seam allowance, and that's why we always cut our fabric pieces a little bit bigger than what they will end up with in our final project. Make sure when you're doing this that you're going through all the layers of the fabric. There'll be 4, right? The seam allowance, the square that you're sewing it to, and that square is seam allowance. So make sure sometimes when you're just catching, you might not catch the whole thing. So make sure that you're going through all of them. Then I'll open it up just like before, and look at that. Our first 2 rows are sewn together. Let's make sure that we open our seams just like before. Open them up, give them a good finger press so that they'll lay nice and flat. Now we're going to add our final row onto the bottom. We're going to do it in exactly the same way. We're going to fold this over. We're going to pin together these 2 rows and making sure that they're lined up nice and neat. Put my pin through right at that seam and right at that seam. Another pin through right at this seam and right at that seam. Make sure everything's nice and lined up. Line up my corners. Everything pinned, and I'm ready to sew. Ta-da! And there you have it, your completed classic 9-patch block. Press all your seams so they're nice and flat. Make sure to take a photo of it and post it to Instagram, tagging Little Free Fibrary or sending it to the email address listed in your booklet. And then pop it in your envelope and send it back so that we can build a community quilt together with everybody's 9-patch block.